Page 206 of The Unfolding is the story of Elizabeth Moore.
It was so scary for me because I'm like, I don't want to say what I'm thinking and feeling. Like, God, are you real? Me praying right now, is anyone hearing this? God, I want to believe what's true. I feel like if I give voice to these dark, scary thoughts, that I could lose everything.
God's story has been unfolding.
Since the beginning of time.
He invites you to be a part of it.
Wow. Another page in The Unfolding.
Hi, this is Meredith Foster. Do you ever have doubts about your faith? I think we all do at some point, but we're not always comfortable admitting that. Elizabeth Moore had grown up in a wonderful Christian community, a place where her faith had taken root and grown. It seemed like everybody she knew had the same faith that she did, and she never really struggled with doubt. After college, she pursued her dream of a career in publishing, and she moved to New York City. And for the first time, she was surrounded by people who didn't believe in the way that she did. And in fact, some who were antagonistic toward faith in God. It led to a season of hard questions, doubts, and fears about the faith that she'd always relied on.
I currently live in New York City, but I was raised in Ruston, Louisiana, a small town in North Louisiana. I loved being raised in Ruston. It was a beautiful community with the church that I grew up going to. My parents actually helped start that church back in the 80s. My parents are a big part of my faith story. They both love Jesus, met Jesus kind of later in their lives. And their faith was very real and vibrant to them. And they taught my brothers and I how to have faiths of our own and how to pray, how to talk to God, how to seek Him, how to know Him, how to hear from Him, how to spend time with Him. And so I feel like I received a really beautiful, rich inheritance of faith from my parents. And then from our community that our family had of other families that either lived in our hometown or went to our church and were believing similar things, were raising their kids to believe similar things. And then me and my brothers became friends with their kids. And so my faith growing up was in this beautiful bubble. It was a very safe bubble where everyone, for the most part, to my limited understanding as a child, it seemed that everyone believed the same thing. And it seemed that we were all on the same page and we were all aligned on what was right and what was wrong and what was true and what was not. Yeah, no really big questions needed to be asked because in my small town world, everything was answered. And so that was growing up all through middle school, high school, adolescence, was in a really sweet youth group and had really great friends in the youth group. And then I actually went to a Christian university after college. And so that was a great experience for me, got a great education, learned a lot of things, but the faith bubble stayed. I didn't really venture out of the faith bubble too much in college. So that was what faith was like for me in my childhood and early adulthood.
So did you have a sense about what you wanted to do? Were you the kind of person who grew up going, oh, here's the career I want to have?
Actually, I did not know what I wanted to do. I knew what I loved. I knew that I loved to read. I knew that I loved to write. I knew that I loved words. Like nothing really made me feel as alive or as myself as when I was reading or writing. So I knew that I wanted to do something with words and with literature. So I did study English literature and writing in college. And then years later went on to work in publishing and to become an author now. But in college, I didn't have that as a goal. I think it was too big at the time. I didn't know to dream that big. So I truly was like, maybe I'll be an English teacher. Like maybe I don't know. I just didn't know. And I had, thankfully, some really good mentorship from my parents and from teachers, basically encouraging me that I don't have to know yet. Like they were encouraging me to pursue what I felt naturally gifted in and called to before knowing exactly how that would play out career-wise. They were like, just be a good steward of this gift and this love that you have for words and books, and then the Lord will provide the career path when it's time.
Wow, that is such great advice.
Yeah, I do feel so lucky. I just stewarded the gift in college, had no idea that publishing was even a possible career path until my senior year of college. That's when I started to entertain the idea of applying for publishing jobs, but I really had zero connections to New York, to traditional publishing houses. So I didn't work in publishing until 3 years after college. Really didn't have an idea for what my life would look like. I really thought I would probably get married and be a mom. And that's not what happened. Not that it can't still happen, but I really did have kind of an idea of what I thought my life would look like, but it felt like a default idea rather than like what I actually dreamed for my life.
That's interesting. So how did that unfold? Like when you graduated college?
Yeah. So when I graduated college, I did start looking into publishing jobs. I tried to move that needle forward using whatever contacts I had, which was not that many, and it didn't happen. So I ended up getting a job at the university that I went to as an admissions counselor. And it was a great job. Worked there for a year, recruiting high school students, traveling around the South. It felt disappointing to get that job because I was like, dang, like I studied English. Like my eyes have been open to the possibilities now of like, I could move to Nashville. I could move to New York. I could do all these things. And none of those doors opened for me at that time. And then I was offered this job in my small college town. Felt like a little bit of a disappointment, a little bit of a step back, but I did feel like it was the Lord's next step for me. So with all of the heaviness of like, oh God, like I'm not exactly excited about this step, I took the step and it ended up being a really beautiful first step for me. After that, I moved to Texas. So I worked the admissions counselor job for 1 year. And then after that, I moved to Texas to work a variety of part-time jobs. I ended up working for a woman who was working on a book. She was also an interior designer. I was her assistant doing the variety of different jobs that she had. And while working for her, because she was writing a book and was looking into literary agents, I started to teach myself and learn alongside her what it looked like to publish a book as an author, as a first-time author. And so just learned on the ground with her and then got connected to another author who is a friend of hers and a friend of my family's who was looking to hire someone part-time virtually to launch her first book back in the summer of 2017. So I worked on this author's book launch, and then she kept me on after her book launch, and I continued to just work for her as an assistant. And then from there, I started to build this kind of like smorgasbord of part-time jobs where I worked as a virtual assistant to various authors.
Were you dreaming about working in the publishing industry, or were you dreaming about being an author, or both?
Oh, great question. Both. I would say first, primary dream was working in publishing. I think in my mind, I wasn't going to be an author until I was like way older, had done my career for years and years, and then finally had something to say. I think I only really thought of like, I'll probably write like a memoir. That was the type of book I saw myself writing. And I'm like, well, I can't write a memoir until I've lived my life. So I was like, I still think that I'm going to write a memoir until decades from now. So I did always have the dream of being an author in the back of my mind, but it wasn't a like thing I was pursuing in my 20s. I was really just pursuing the publishing career. So I worked for those authors for a couple of years, just started to gain more experience and insight into what does the publishing industry look like from the author's perspective. And I loved it. I was like, I love it. Books are for me. Books are my world. I want to be here. But I lived in Texas, and there's very few opportunities to work in publishing full-time the way I wanted to in Texas. But I had a just informational interview call with one of my authors that I was working for, her editor. And she was the one that was like, well, if you want to work in publishing full-time, you need to move to New York. And I was like, oh, okay. Like she just straight up, honestly, she's not wrong. Like maybe it's now different now because so many jobs are remote. But back in 2018, like to pursue the career I wanted to pursue, I did need to live in New York. I started to pray and ask God to open doors for me to move to New York. And I had absolutely zero connections in New York City back in, this is 2017, I think. And so I set an alarm on my phone every day for 3 p.m., 3:30. And it would go off and I would ask God to open doors for me to move to New York. And through the course of the next several months, I started telling my friends, hey, I'm praying for God to move me to New York. And then they started connecting me with their friends. They're like, okay, you need to talk to my friend who lives in New York or my friend who once lived in New York and has connections. And so I started jumping on calls, exchanging emails with people. And then through that kind of networking from afar, I heard about this program called the Columbia Publishing Course, which is through Columbia University. And it's like a post-grad course that launches your career into publishing. And so I looked into that, applied for the course, got in. It just felt like the Lord led that and had put a lot of favor onto that because it was, in my understanding, a pretty competitive thing to apply to. And I had no connections. I was just from a small town in the South. But I remember writing my heart and soul into my application essay. And I was like, I will put everything into this.
Do you remember what you said in that?
You know what? It's actually been on my mind to go reread that essay for the last several weeks. But I'm pretty sure what I wanted to do was tell people stories. I think Meredith, our hearts are aligned. And what you're doing with the Unfolding podcast is like, we experience more of God and we learn more about God when we hear other people's stories. And so I saw that I might be able to do that if I worked in publishing through books. I wanted to be someone who ushered people's stories into the world. And I wanted to be able to help release beauty and truth through the written word into the world. And there's a lot that's published that's not beauty and truth. So I just wanted to come into publishing and maybe have eyes for what is something that's beautiful, what's something that's honest, what's something that reveals God to us, even if it's not a religious text, even if it's straight up like a secular memoir or a fiction novel or whatever. Like, I feel like there are definitely glimpses of God that we can get in non-religious works. And so I wanted to work in those types of books and help people meet God through books. And somehow I said that in an essay to Columbia University that they said yes to. So I think, I don't know. I might have focused in on the beauty, the truth, the honesty, I just want to tell people stories. I want people to tell their stories.
All right. I have to ask, where were you when you found out you got admitted?
That's so funny that you ask. I remember I was in Walmart. It was amazing. I was in Walmart with terrible service. And so I remember like answering the phone, hearing the director of the Columbia Publishing course's voice on the other end. And she was breaking up and I was like, oh, so I like ran into another aisle where there was better service. She was sharing with me that I got into both programs. So there's a New York City program and an Oxford University program. She was like, you got into both, you can choose. And then the call cuts out and I'm like, no. I'm like running out of the store, like just like throwing my basket into the aisle because I hadn't actually bought the things I was going to get. And I'm like running outside to get better service just to hear her and accept immediately.
There's something beautiful just about that. Just
Yeah.
that. So you had your choice of a program in New York City or at Oxford?
Oxford University. Yes. So I chose Oxford because, well, yeah, people were like, well, of course you did. And both programs are amazing. And there's a lot of benefit to going to the New York program because you are so closely linked to the jobs in New York immediately after. But my plan was to move to New York after the course anyway. I didn't do any type of studying abroad during my undergrad. And I just have always felt this connection to the UK, the British countryside. Who doesn't? I grew up reading like British literature. So I'm like, okay, this is my chance.
Well, let's talk about that. I assume you're just kind of riding high on faith. God's been stirring this in your heart. He's gifted you. You have this dream. It's coming to pass. What was faith like in that season and going to Oxford?
Yeah, it was that. And then it was also this shadow side started to emerge. Yeah, I was seeing God answer my prayers right and left. I had set this prayer alarm. I was asking him to provide. He was providing. Of course, the actual like me establishing myself and establishing a career in New York was still yet to come. But I was like, I think you're setting these things in motion, God. I am totally riding high on faith. And at the time, I'm making these big decisions to quit all of my part-time jobs that I had been working, to like not re-sign my lease in Texas so that I can go off and do this course in faith that I will then move to New York immediately after and start a new life there. So I was shutting down one life, all in good terms, but I hadn't yet grasped on to the handle of security in the next life. I didn't have a place to live. I didn't have a job in New York. I was just kind of like, I hope that works out. So I was very full of faith and hope and excitement and on this momentum of like, my dreams are coming true. But I still had a lot of fear and apprehension that the rest of the story wouldn't pan out for some reason. And then I also had a lot of, fear and doubt about whether this was something God actually wanted me to do. Even though he was providing and opening all the doors, I think there was still the part of me that was like, this is my dream. This is going to be so fun. That there was like another voice in my head that was like, is this what God really wants? And I think maybe all that was maybe like an understanding I had internalized early in life that like God has hard plans for us, or God doesn't want our dreams to come true because he wants us to suffer, to grow us. So I'm like, God, how could you have a like fun life in New York for me? That's too good. So I remember feeling a lot of doubt about, am I actually hearing God's voice? Am I just doing my own thing? Am I just going off to party and have a good time and build my own name? I really wrestled with that. And where I landed was just like a genuine surrender of, God, there might be mixed motives here. I really do want to go to New York and serve you in the publishing industry and just do all the things that I said in my entrance essay to the Columbia Publishing course. I want all of that with my whole heart. But I think it'll be fun. Some of this is for me. And I think that's kind of what started this path into honesty and prayer, where you're just like giving your whole heart to God, even the mix of motives, being like, God, I want this because for all these things that seem very like holy and I don't know, like very self-sacrificing. But I'm like, also, there's a lot of me in this and there's a lot of my dreams wrapped up in this too. And I'm just going to be honest with you.
You had mentioned earlier that you had pretty much had really strong community around you growing up in high school and youth group and family. Were the community of believers around you going, yes, do it?
Yeah.
Community makes So helpful.
It does. It really does. I had made a big decision in the past, like a few years prior, that I had not asked community to really weigh in on, and that was to my detriment. And so I really learned from that experience. Facing a new kind of big life choice, like move to New York, pursue a new career. I was like, this time I'm really going to involve my community. And so I really did. I asked friends to pray and to kind of share their perspective, brought my parents into the experience. And I don't think I did it perfectly because I still was pretty independent in it. But I do think it was a step in the right direction of wanting to bring community into it.
How long were you at Oxford?
It was just a month long. I did that the month of September in 2018. And then after the course, I went back to my parents' house for 1 week and packed up all my things. And then a week later, took a one-way flight to New York City. And my parents are probably just like weeping in the back. Like, what is she doing? I didn't have a job yet. God did provide a place for me to live, which was like such a cool God story. But I really just moved to New York on a hope and a dream and a savings account that was not that big. It would not have lasted me very long at all.
So let's talk about what happens from there.
Yeah. So job-wise, that God just did provide so much. While I was still doing the course, we were being guided through the application process. We're learning all about how to work in publishing. And part of that is like how to get a job. So we're getting coached on how to write our resumes, how to write our cover letters, how to interview, how to network and ask people for informational interviews. So I moved to New York ready to go. I'm like, my full-time job is looking for a job until I get a job. And so I was like emailing people. I'm setting up lunches. I'm setting up coffees. So on the second day that I'm there, I go to lunch with a friend of a friend, and he was a production editor at Simon & Schuster, and his wife was the executive assistant to the president of Simon & Schuster, which seemed like a very fortunate connection. And they were very generous and just wanted to help me. They were asking about what pending applications I had submitted that I hadn't heard back from. And I mentioned one at Vintage and Anchor Books, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House. And they just very graciously were like, we know the editorial director there. We'll shoot her an email. And they did. And then the next day I got a call to come in and interview for the job. And I got offered the job the next day. That does not happen.
That's one of those crazy move to New York stories, why so many people move to New York, because they're always hoping that's going to happen, but it doesn't happen that way very often.
And I've since tasted the reality of, I've since moved jobs and tried to move jobs and tasted the difficult grind of applying, interviewing, nothing. The discouragement. So I'm like, I get that. So the fact that that was my story of like when I first came here and it was so easy, I'm like, that is so rare. That was the Lord's kindness and provision, I think.
So what was it like to actually start working? You've moved away from a lot of your community. I'm just curious what faith was like as you're making that transition.
Yes. So faith was interesting. It was getting really real. It got tough in England, actually, doing the Columbia Publishing course. That was really my first time being fully part of a community that I really loved and was growing to trust. Like I'm doing workshops and studying and staying up really late and having these really fun experiences, living in dorms with this group of other aspiring publishing people. And I'm maybe one of two Christians in our group of 30, 40 people. And that was one of the first times that I'd ever been in a community like that, where like faith was not a thing that we talked about, where faith was not a shared language. If anything, Christianity was a laughable thing of the past. I was being confronted with the other ways that the world experiences Christianity. And it was very shocking to me and very scary to me and sad to me. And I started to kind of see from their perspective as well and be like, oh, what if they're right? And so I was just confronted with all these different perspectives that I had to wrestle with and that I couldn't just bat away. But I also had this very deep, rich inheritance of faith that I also couldn't bat away. I'm like, this is so real to me and beautiful to me. And I believe it and I want to believe it. And I've seen really beautiful things come of it. But also I want to hold space for my new friends who have not had that experience and have a totally different belief system or just lack of a belief system at all and have a lot of hurt towards people of faith or the institution of the church for very good reasons. And so, was just really wrestling with all of that for the first time and didn't really know what to do with that. I think that my experience in Oxford was just the shock of, oh, this is different and this is new and I feel alone and I'm not sure. It wasn't that I wasn't sure what I believed, but I was just scared by, do I believe the right thing? But then I continued to pray and to seek God. And England was also a really beautiful time where I spent a lot of time with God. And I spent a lot of time just like going on walks alone traveling alone, going into these old, beautiful, like centuries old historic churches and just like sensing the presence of God with me in those times. And so, yeah, it was a mix. It was a mix of the most beautiful times of intimacy with God and also the most intense time of doubt, questions, being unsure. I was so glad that I experienced that because I'm like, okay, this is what it's like to live in the world. I had a beautiful sheltered experience for the first part of my life, but like to be a true like citizen of the world is to know more than just one kind of belief system and to live in that echo chamber. So I'm glad that I was exposed to that. I'm glad I am exposed to that. Like I think it's made me a better adult and just a better person. Yeah, it was the shock for sure. And then moving to New York, that just continued. This is the new normal. This is my life now. Up until this point, this is what it is to be a Christian in New York, to be a Christian in the world, anywhere. So I continued to pursue God and try to maintain my own personal faith, but also had all these big questions and doubts rumbling around in my mind. And they definitely continued and intensified as I moved to New York, as I started working at Penguin Random House, started working with coworkers who did not share the same faith. And if anything, were pretty antagonistic towards my faith or just the caricature of Christianity. I was so shy that I really was not very open about my faith because I was like, I don't want to be verbally smacked down by all these people. So I just kept it to myself until I formed a friendship of trust with a coworker. But it wasn't this thing that I was like making a huge deal until I published my books, which that came out, which that made my faith pretty public a few years later. But it ended up being a really sweet process. My first year and a half in New York is when I really wrestled with faith. That's when I first started to engage in really, really honest prayer with God. And it scared me a little bit to, instead of just praying like all these easy, beautiful prayers, I started to pray some dark prayers and to ask God some hard questions and to really be honest and vulnerable with God about the dark feelings that I was feeling and the big questions that I was having. And I really didn't know what would happen. I was like, I feel like on one end, I feel like if I give voice to these dark, scary thoughts, that I could lose everything. I was like, I feel like my faith could be upturned. It was so scary for me because I'm like, I don't want to say what I'm thinking and feeling because I think that's I'll lose my faith or I'll lose my community or everyone in my community will either disown me or be really disappointed in me. I just feel like I'm going to get lost if I share what I'm actually going through.
Those fears were keeping Elizabeth from sharing her doubts with anyone. In fact, fear was feeding fear. She didn't yet know that God loves honest prayers. When you say I was afraid to give voice to some of those really scary thoughts and prayers, can you give an example of what kinds of things you were praying?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the big questions were just like, God, are you real? Very simple. Are you real? Is me praying right now? Is anyone hearing this? Is the voice that I've always thought was your voice, is that just my voice? Or is it you? Was Jesus real? Did he actually die? Did he actually rise from the dead? Big church questions too, like is that all actually true and right and good, or are there other ways? Are there, all these big questions.
Yeah.
I think the biggest prayer was just, I felt this like angst of God, I want to believe what's true and I don't feel confident in that anymore. So that was mostly my big angsty prayer of just asking God, show me what's true, show me what's right. The only one I actually need answered is just a deep internal sense of who you actually are. And I want to feel confident in that again.
So that played out over more than a year's time.
Yeah, about a year and a half.
What were the things that helped, or do you remember moments along the way where you had important conversations? What were the markers when you think back over that?
Yeah, a couple things do come to mind. And the big theme of all of them is like, when I finally got brave enough to share with someone what I was actually going through, instead of being met by what I feared I would be met with, which was like, we're so scared for you, you're falling off the path. Instead of being met with more fear, I was being met with lots of encouragement. People being like, oh, you're questioning your faith? That's amazing. This is so good. I questioned my faith and it made my faith deeper. And I was being met with encouragement of our faith doesn't grow if we don't question it. And so I was like, oh, this is actually maybe a good thing, to be having some questions and to be actually wrestling with them rather than ignoring them, rather than pretending they're not there. So a couple of like big marker conversations come to mind. And one was, I remember while I was still in Oxford, it was like my last week, I traveled to London for the weekend And one of the authors that I had worked for previously, she was like, you need to connect with another author. Friend of hers lived in London. Her name was Shelley Miller. She's beautiful, beautiful author. And unfortunately, she's since passed away of cancer in the last 3 years. So I feel very, very fortunate to have gotten to be her friend just in the last couple of years of her life. Her and her husband were pastors in London. She took me out to coffee my last few days of being in the UK. And I was, for some reason, so honest with this complete stranger about what I was feeling and all the things Oxford had brought up. And I feel like the Lord has brought her in my life for that day to be kind of a really big encouragement for me. And as someone who not only worked in the industry that I was about to start working in, but she also was a woman who had been to the depths and back with God. And she was like, this is so good, Elizabeth. She just really encouraged me that God had big plans for me, that God wanted to use these questions, that God is with me in the darkness. He's not going anywhere, but I have to go through it. And so that was so encouraging to just have a wise woman of faith who I was like, I want to be like you one day. Her be like, this is not alarming to me. This is actually a good sign. I think that God is still with you and he's going to do beautiful things through this. So I took that with me to New York. And then another really impactful conversation was when I shared with my parents that I was having some doubts. I thought that they would be the most worried and I thought that they would be the most alarmed. And they were just great. I mean, not flippantly great, but they were not surprised. They were we're really glad to hear this. This means your faith is growing and you're kind of pushing against these boundary lines that have always kept you so safe. And you're now going to your faith is going to grow and you're going to learn how to have a growing and active faith rather than a stagnant faith. So I, just received some encouragement from them. And then they also walked alongside me in that. So I started to read a lot of books with my dad, started to have some conversations with him, would start to bring some of my questions to light with him and he would give me his perspective on them. And sometimes we'd disagree. Sometimes I would hear what he had to say or he would give me something to read and I'd be like, nope, I don't like this. Or this rubbed me the wrong way for this reason. And that's okay. And I learned how to just engage in some healthy dialogue and to respect each other's perspectives. And I learned how to build my own perspective and learned how to both engage with mentors and seek wisdom from mentors and receive from them while also kind of hearing from the Lord on my own or hearing from myself and starting to trust myself.
I know that one of the things you mentioned, when you were growing up, your parents had really helped you develop rhythms of life, like spending time with God or scripture and hearing from him. That was one of the things that you mentioned. What is hearing from him? What did it look like for you in that season of your life?
So I'd say growing up, I didn't really know that I was hearing from the Lord, but looking back, I'm I think that I was. So I did have this just really beautiful practice of journaling every night before I went to bed. It started in middle school. I think without realizing it, I was journaling prayers. And I knew I was talking to God in my journal, even if I wasn't dear God, and then writing out a prayer. I just knew that what I was journaling, I was offering up as a prayer to God. And what I would experience pretty consistently was as I was writing out a confusing thought or a question or something I was wrestling with, as I'm writing it out, I would get a gentle answer back. And then I would write that answer out in my journal. I just didn't know what it was at the time. I think I was just answers are coming to me or just understanding is coming to me. Things are becoming more clear as I journal. I love journaling. And now I'm looking back and I'm Elizabeth, you were praying and the Spirit was speaking to you. You got to know the Lord's voice of kindness. You got to know the Good Shepherd's voice early in your life. And so I think that as an adult, it's been a practice of learning how to hear the shepherd's voice still. And so I still try to journal and try to hear the Lord's voice through that. Yeah, in the time of really intense doubting, I really doubted that I could hear his voice at all. It wasn't as easy as journaling and hearing. I think that was in the time of doubting, I was is this just me? But there were times where my spirit would just get very, very quiet and still. And I would just hear a word. And it was usually very few that felt very powerful. They were very succinct and brief. They answered a lot of questions at once. And I was this must be the Lord's voice. I don't think it's me that could give myself 2 words and still a lot of stormy waves in me. I do think I heard the Lord's voice a few times in that season. And it was always very brief and it was very simple. I was able to test it. I was okay, I think these words are from the Lord. And then over the next few weeks or months, I would continue to call those words to mind and see if they continued to sustain me, and they did.
How long did it take to build a community of believers in New York City? What was that like?
I was very fortunate. I was able to plug into Christian community pretty quickly just through my church. A mutual friend connected me with actually Audrey, my co-author of Liturgies for Hope and Liturgies for Wholeness. She was one of my first friends in New York, which is such a blessing. She was already going to Church of the City, New York, which is where we go to church now. She was already very involved in a community group and some friend groups. And so I just kind of tagged along with her for the first couple months. And then through friends I met through her, I would meet other friends. And so just kind of like the network group pretty quickly. And also what I've found in the Christian community in New York is that people want to welcome you. As soon as I moved to New York, I never felt like the new kid, because I think there's always new kids in New York. Every week people are moving to New York with a hope and a dream. And so it's so common to meet someone who's like, I moved here 2 weeks ago. I moved here a month ago. And we just throw them right into the mix. There's always a place for someone in New York because there's so much turnover. Sometimes that can be hard because it is so transient, but it really does allow me, and I think most people in general, to jump into community pretty quickly.
So the season of wrestling, sharing your doubts with your family, walking through that, was there a time when you realized I've kind of settled into a new faith, or what did that look like?
That's such a good question. I don't think there was one time where I was like, it's over or like, I'm done. I think what I learned is I'm like there were different periods of relief. I would just be like, oh, wow, I haven't felt super angsty in a couple months. Like, I feel more at peace about this one issue or this one question than I've felt in a long time. So it was kind of a slow releasing over time of peace. But I also think it was just the new normal. I still wrestle with questions and I still have doubts at times come up. I think what that season did for me was equip me with some tools to know how to confront those questions and move through that time with God and with community rather than hand in hand with fear. The tide really turned during COVID. We all went into survival mode and prayer was really a lifeline for me. So I think that's when I was like, oh no, this is it for me. Like I'm here. I'm sticking it out. I'm here. I'm God's. I believe this. I'm here for it. Like this is how I'm going to live my life. And this is the direction I'm going to continue going in my faith.
You mentioned there were some tools that helped you through it. And now you know to go to use those tools when you start wrestling with something. Can you describe what those are?
Yeah. One of the biggest ones is honesty in prayer. It is honesty in prayer that led to the books of liturgies, because that's all that those books are just honest prayers. I learned to not silence my feelings. I learned to not push them away. I learned to not shame myself for feeling anything. I learned to invite God into those feelings with me. But then I asked for his light and his voice to show me, like, what is beneath this feeling? What is this feeling trying to tell me? No question, no feeling is too shameful for God and is too shameful for me or for my community. So I just learned to embrace all those kind of dark sides of me and to trust that God has a path and an answer for all those things. None of those feelings or questions disqualify me from faith, from being a Christian. And then over time, I started to see this as, oh, this is actually such an adventure. I mean, it's scary too, but I started to see faith as an exciting adventure with ups and downs, with scary things, with little caves, with like bright patches, with just like scary bogs. Like it's all such an adventure. And I am never alone on this adventure, but it's going to look so different than I expected. My adventure is different from my mom's. It's different from my dad's. It's different from like someone else's. I've just started to trust God on this adventure.
I can hear how your confidence in him grew, that there was nothing too difficult to bring to him. I think one of the things that happens is we're afraid of the doubts that we feel, and fear can shut us down. We're even afraid to ask God about it. So I love that one of the things that you've learned through it is that he's not afraid of anything. Fear is often the enemy for us. And so learning that you didn't have to be afraid, you don't have to be afraid of him. You didn't have to be afraid of the process. Sounds like that was a big part of what you went through.
Yes, it was a huge thing that I learned. I thought I did have to be afraid of it. I thought there were things to fear. And now there's nothing to fear. There's nothing that God can't meet me in and nothing that he can't bring me out of or bring me through or be with me in. So even though I still get scared, I still get freaked out by doubts and questions. And I'm like, is this okay? Like, this is crazy. Just knowing that it is going to be okay. He is with me. He will get me to the other side of this. Another tool maybe is just putting things into the light. And that kind of goes hand in hand with being honest, but bringing to light the things that you're afraid of, bringing to light the questions, because then you can see them for what they actually are. Like when you look it straight in the eyes and you're like, I see you. And you're kind of scary, but you're actually not as scary in the light as you were in the dark. And also now that I see you, I'm going to invite God to see you, and I'm going to invite my community to see you, and we're all going to see you. And you lose a lot of power when a lot of eyeballs are on you in broad daylight. And so that is like been really helpful for me on my journey too, is that takes a lot of the power of fear away. And then you're able to just see the issue or the question or whatever for what it actually is and move forward.
So you had mentioned earlier that you thought years down the road, you'd write a book, but you initially were just thinking about being in the publishing industry, just working in the publishing industry. Well, that obviously changed. How did that happen?
Yeah, how did that happen? Yes, the books are such a byproduct of everything we're talking about, which is so beautiful. Yeah, did not have a plan to publish a book anytime soon. But during COVID, my best friend, Audrey, and we were wondering, how could we bring beauty into the world during this time? I was in New York. I was so anxious. I just didn't know what the day would hold, didn't know what this pandemic was doing to our world, a lot of anxiety. And I just had to do something with my nervous energy. I had been learning the last year and a half to just put all of my difficult feelings into prayer. And so that's something that Audrey and I decided to do together. We were like, what if we turned all of our anxiety, all of our fear, if we brought all of it out into the light and wrote prayers, not only for ourselves, but for other people, so that they can have like an anchor to hold on to, or something to provide comfort for them, or something to unify them in this difficult time. And I've just seen the power of being honest with God and of bringing what you're actually afraid of into light. So we're like, here are some prayers that straight up acknowledge, like, we're scared of this. We're scared of getting sick. We're scared of our loved ones getting sick. We are absolutely exhausted by the news, just very specific issues. And we wrote prayers that honestly addressed those issues, and then also looked to scripture for truth that God has already given us to speak into those specific issues. And so we wrote those into a poetic format that we call liturgy. And we wrote a series of 11 liturgies, and we just gave them to our church. That was all that it was ever supposed to be. It was just supposed to be like a poetic offering for our church. And then they got shared really widely. One church in London ended up reading one of the liturgies to their congregation. And then one of the people in the congregation was an editor for a publishing house in London. She heard the liturgy and was like, these need to be a book. And so she reached out to us and got the ball rolling. Would you guys be interested in making these liturgies a book? And we were like, sure. And the initial series of liturgies was not meant to be a book. It was supposed to be in our church newsletter. And then the doors got opened for them to be a book. And then kind of similar to the job trajectory, I've also seen it's hard to get a book made. But this was just too easy. You know, it's one of those things where it's like, it's not supposed to be this easy, which leads me to believe that it was just the Lord wanted it to happen. Mm-hmm. And so it's been such a blessing, such an exciting gift to be able to write these books and to share these liturgies with people who want to pray, but maybe don't have the words, who like want to be honest with God, but maybe don't know how yet. And so it just kind of is like a starter pack to honesty with God. So yeah, Liturgies for Hope was the first book. That came about through COVID. And then Liturgies for Wholeness came out earlier this year. And Liturgies for Wholeness is just a companion to the first one. We wanted to write a book of prayers to help people maybe like heal some brokenness that might be in them and move them on the path towards wholeness. Because I just think God wants us to be whole.
I was sitting in a coffee shop a couple of days ago, and I was reading through Liturgies for Wholeness. And honestly, I picked it up to read it mainly as I was preparing. I was preparing because I knew I was going to talk to you. I was surprised at the emotional reaction I had as I was reading through some of the prayers. Part of it is even just using the word liturgy is this reminder that there's a community of believers that came before us, thousands of years, who have engaged in this practice, and just being reminded of that community, but also just in the moment, there's something about the very simple language that you use in them that makes you feel close to God. And who doesn't want to experience? I experienced his presence sitting in a coffee shop. Is there one that you would be willing to read? Do you have a favorite one?
Yeah. And this goes right along with what we've been talking about, but it's in Liturgies for Hope, the first one. But a lot of the liturgies in the faith section are written out of that time that we've just been talking about. Totally. These are like my wrestles put to words. Okay. And then the one I think I will read is a liturgy for those embracing the mystery of faith. Because I think that's kind of what I was doing in that year and a half was wrestling, asking questions. And I came out on the other side being like, wow, this is such a beautiful mystery. And I want to embrace that mystery. And I want to be open to faith always being like both a sturdy thing, but also a mysterious thing. I'll just read a liturgy for those embracing the mystery of faith. When we question everything we once thought we believed, help us, gentle teacher, to be brave explorers of the unknown. When doubts multiply in our minds, help us not to be afraid, but to be curious. When questions arise about your existence, your goodness, the way of your salvation, help us press in and believe that you are present in the mystery. Teacher, we're longing for someone to give us assurance. We measure you with our own intellect, looking for answers in books, academia, pop culture, and critics. But faith is impossible when we seek it within the bounds of our own understanding. We become fools when we claim to be wise. So help us reach beyond what we know. Help us step into wonder, into learning, into trusting you for flourishing. The adventure of faith is there. We are like sheep without a shepherd, listening to the wisdom of the world, allowing ourselves to be discipled by culture. Would you liberate us from our compulsive need to understand? Would you marvelously kindle our imaginations? Would you help us hold space for not knowing, for being wrong, for trusting you with what we can't comprehend? Give us a spirit of humility all the days of our lives so we keep coming back to you. O God, echoes of your essence vault across the sky from sunrise to sunset. Help us seek you with urgency and wonder, with childlikeness instead of childishness, until a foundation of faith, sturdy and timeless, is revealed. Warm our hearts to faith and wonder as we wait for you. Though we bring more questions than answers, though the discomfort of doubt threatens to unravel us, in faith we treasure the tension of this promise. With man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible. Keep us alive in the famine of our faith until we become what we believe. In weakness, yes, we do believe. Help our unbelief. Amen.
Isn't it just like God to take the hard season of doubts and questioning that Elizabeth went through and then turn it into a book that now brings hope and comfort to many others? It's just another beautiful example of how God can redeem anything we go through. The books are called Liturgies for Hope and Liturgies for Wholeness. They're collections of modern liturgies with scripture references for every prayer. When you don't know what to pray, these are a beautiful way to jumpstart conversations with God. And if you're dealing with doubts in your faith, Elizabeth talks about how Psalm 131 is a really comforting scripture to read. It's one that reminds you that you are safe with God, like a child with its mother, and you can trust Him, and you can put your hope in Him. You can find the books on Amazon or at elizabethmoorewriting.com. You can also look for Elizabeth J. Moore on Instagram. And we are so grateful to Elizabeth for sharing her story. Hey, would you help spread the word about the God stories you hear on The Unfolding? When you share an episode with a friend or maybe mention a story on social media, it helps more people learn about the miraculous stories that God is writing every day. And if you love The Unfolding, would you leave a review on your favorite podcast app? Like this one was on Apple Podcasts. It said, "My favorite podcast of all time. This podcast will bless you. I've listened to every single episode. The way God works in people's lives is astounding and faith-building and such a blessing." You know, when you share a kind review like that, it helps others to find The Unfolding. If you'd like to help this kind of inspiring storytelling grow, you can support the Wow God Podcast Network. You could make a monthly gift of $40, or really a gift of any size makes a difference, at wowgod.com. Thanks to the Unfolding team, Lindsay Caparoon, Michael Shermack, our producer and network director, Jason Rackout. Do you know he's also an incredible artist? He's such a Renaissance man. The Unfolding is a Wow God production, a ministry of the University of Northwestern St. Paul. You can discover more at wowgod.com. We'll be back next week with another page of The Unfolding.